I wanted to acknowledge our sponsors. Many thanks to College of Liberal Arts and Science, who is the main sponsor of this event, and other sponsors, including Geography and Sustainable Planning Department, Regional Math and Science Center, Office of Sustainable Practices, and Michigan Space Grant. Thanks again for tuning in, and I would like now to turn in the screen to Dean Donovan Anderson.
Thank you, Elena. The College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Grand Valley State University is a proud supporter of the Climate Change Education Solutions Network. And we're especially thankful for the work that Elena has done to connect the people involved in this network and to organize this impactful summit. One of the aspects that attracted us to this network was the interdisciplinary, interinstitutional, and community-connected profile of the organization. The work you all do transcends traditional boundaries and narrow specialties. A look at the list of speakers and discussants at this year's summit confirms that. Community activists, city officials, policymakers, educators, and academics with a wide range of disciplinary expertise. And this kind of collaboration is critical to support the solution-oriented climate change education you are promoting. Today's keynote speaker is Erik Nordman. He's a professor of natural resources management at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. He teaches courses in resource management, including environmental economics and natural resources policy. Erik's research topics include the social dimensions of ecosystem services and renewable energy. During his 2019-2020 sabbatical, he was a visiting scholar at the Ostrom workshop. His research there resulted in the book, The Uncommon Knowledge of Elinor Ostrom, Essential Lessons for Collective Action, and it was published earlier this year by Island Press. In the book, Professor Nordman brings to life the ideas and research of Ostrom, whose work showing how communities can sustainably manage common resources won her a Nobel Prize in economics. Ostrom's revolutionary proposition fundamentally changed how we think about environmental governance. From overfishing to deforestation and water rights, the natural resources we rely on are increasingly under threat from both overuse and the impacts of climate change. Conventional thinking on environmental governance has held that protecting these resources requires restrictions either from the government or the free market. But is there a third way forward, one that harnesses the ability of communities to successfully manage their common resources? Erik Nordman explores how Ostrom developed her research, showing that people can and do act in collective interest. His book highlights the inspiring work of community leaders and stakeholders who have spearheaded innovative resource-sharing systems, from Valencia, Spain's millennium-old water court, to emerging topics like internet governance and cybersecurity. I'd like to welcome Erik Nordman to talk about the GVSU Collaborative Climate Action, scaling up from local to global commons.
Thank you very much, Donovan. And thank you all for attending this session. I really appreciate your interest in this topic. I'm going to share my screen. Once again, thank you. And yeah, I'll be talking about collaborative climate action, scaling up from local to global commons. And this is really about the work of Elinor Ostrom. She, like Donovan said in the introduction, she won the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on collaborative economic governance of environmental resources, especially things like common pool resources or the commons. We can think of the Earth's climate system as a commons. So the Earth's climate system has a limited capacity to absorb greenhouse gases, and while keeping the temperature within a livable range for human civilization. But this resource, our climate system, is depletable. Right? If we overwhelm that climate system, it's going to tip over and cause lots of damages to human life, human well-being, the natural world, and our infrastructure. So this climate system can be depleted as we pollute the system with greenhouse gases. The challenge is, though, it's hard to exclude people from polluting. It's not necessarily impossible, but we pollute every day with our choices to drive cars, and on a bigger scale, our whole energy infrastructure is based on fossil fuels. So this sets up a type of resource called a commons, sometimes called an open access resource, which is really a more technical term for it, but today we'll call it a commons. Commons are all kinds of resources that can be depletable and are hard to exclude people from using or accessing. These include things like fisheries and forests and all kinds of other resources. Now, when it comes to a resource like a commons, the conventional wisdom was that a commons was doomed to destruction. And you may have heard this term from a famous essay by the title, The Tragedy of the Commons. This essay was written by ecologist Garrett Hardin and published in 1968 in Science magazine. It was wildly successful, and it's one of Science magazine's most downloaded and requested articles ever published. It really caught the imagination, especially at this time in 1968, when people's, especially in the United States, our environmental consciousness was really blossoming. People were very concerned about the environment, and people were looking for a metaphor for how we can restrain our environmental overexploitation. Hardin viewed these common pool resources through this metaphor of a common pasture that was open to grazing by everyone in the community. Everyone has their own self-interest to add more animals to their herd. But if everybody follows their own self-interest, we're quickly going to overgraze this common pasture, and we will all be worse off for it. Hardin saw this as a metaphor for many environmental challenges that we face in the 20th and 21st centuries. His article was really about one particular problem, and that was the problem, what he called the problem of overpopulation. We're not going to talk about that. That is loaded with topics like eugenics and really awful things like that. And we don't have time to get into that whole discussion. So we're going to focus on Hardin's general metaphor of what to do about the destruction of the commons. Are people really trapped? Well, he said, no, we're not necessarily doomed if we do one of two things. We could either convert this commons to private property. We could take that common pasture and put up a bunch of fences, and everybody in the community gets their own patch of grass. And if I choose to overgraze my patch, it doesn't affect someone else, right? So we could convert it to private property and trade and let markets figure it out. That's one solution that Hardin proposed. Another solution is top-down government regulation. Have an outside entity like the government impose restrictions on the community members. Hardin was very clear that he did not think that the community members themselves could overcome these incentives to overuse the commons. So these were the two choices that Hardin proposed, and that was the conventional wisdom for all kinds of resources through much of the 20th century. Either privatize it and let the markets figure it out, or have the government intervene and restrict people. But is this true? Are people really trapped and they have no agency, no capacity to overcome these limited self-interests? And are there really only two solutions? Maybe not. But when it comes to climate change, like we said, the climate is a commons. And for 30 years, policymakers have sought a global response to this global problem. And they've been largely following, the outline, the model set forth by Garrett Hardin. One approach would be to privatize the global commons, but that's not really possible, right? You can't put a fence around the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide in particular is a very well-mixed gas. You don't have concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases above high-emitting countries, right? It distributes all around the globe. So there's no way to really privatize the climate commons. We have one global commons. Well, then, according to Hardin, that just leaves top-down legally binding regulations. And for those 30 years, since the 1992 Earth Summit and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, global leaders have been looking for one big top-down approach, a legally binding approach that will apply to all the countries of the world. They tried to do this. The countries tried to do this with the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, but this didn't really work. Several high emitters like the United States, didn't even join the Kyoto Protocol. We never ratified it through Congress, through the Senate. And some developing countries that were high emitters like China weren't even required to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So it was legally binding for those countries that joined the Kyoto Protocol, but it didn't really work. At the time, back in 1992, Elinor Ostrom, a political scientist at Indiana University, had been studying commons and common pool resources all around the world. And she started looking at this question of climate change way back in 1992. And she said that if we simply wait until the big guys make a decision, we are in deep trouble, right? This problem is getting worse. And the longer we wait for a single legally binding global solution that everyone will agree on, well, that day might never come and the problem is just going to get worse. Ostrom thought that there might be a better way that people in countries and in subnational units and local governments can act across scales in coordinated ways to reduce greenhouse gases. Elinor Ostrom was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics for her work on what the Nobel Committee said was economic governance, especially the commons. She was a political scientist, so she was a little bit of an outsider winning this economics Nobel. But instead of Hardin's view that commons were a market failure, which was the conventional wisdom in economics as well, that commons are a market failure and are doomed to overuse, Ostrom found that commons are an intentional way of organizing. They're not some, as she said, a relic from a long ago past, that these are ways of intentionally organizing how to use a resource, right? Hardin talked about privatization and government regulation as the only two ways to avoid this tragedy of the commons. But Ostrom found that communities all over the world, here in the United States and virtually every other country, have worked together. They have collaborated through self-governance to manage their common pool resources. It's not easy to do. It doesn't always work, but there is a third way. There's privatization might be appropriate in some cases. Government regulation might be appropriate in other cases. But in between, there's a vast opportunity for civil society institutions to come together and manage their own resources themselves using and enforcing rules that they create. Ostrom came to this conclusion after a career of looking at common pool resources all over the world. In doing so, she collaborated with scholars in many different fields, from forestry to anthropology, sociology, economics, and her fellow political scientists. She looked at all kinds of resource systems and built a database of hundreds, even thousands of case studies. She found examples from fisheries, like the lobster fishery in Maine, where the lobster harvesters themselves come together to establish territories, rules about who gets to access those territories, and ways to enforce them. Led a project looking at forest institutions around the world, how communities manage their own forest resources. One of these sites was in her backyard outside of Bloomington, Indiana, at the May Creek Farm. That's pictured here. But she also collaborated with scholars in India, in Michigan, in Nepal, and in East Africa. And she also looked at irrigation communities, like this one in Valencia, Spain, where the farmers themselves elect farmers to a water court to resolve disputes and make decisions about how to allocate water in different canal districts. So she looked at these cases all around the world in all these different fields and worked with all these different scholars. And from this, she was able to tease out what are some of the things that are present when a commons is well managed and sustained, and what is missing when a commons fails to be sustained or breaks down. And through this work, she and her colleagues identified 8 what they call design principles for sustaining a common pool resource. One of these, the first one, is that the physical and social boundaries are clearly defined. One needs to know who has access to this resource and who doesn't. Where does the resource stop? So for the canal districts of Valencia, Spain, for example, that's pretty obvious. It's people who get the water from a particular canal. That's, defined by the topography itself. But there are also social dimensions to this. For example, in the lobsters in Maine, if I show up with a fishing license, that doesn't mean I can just set a trap in a particular harbor. I have to be accepted into the resource using community there, what they call a harbor gang or lobster gang. So just having the legal right to fish doesn't mean that I have the social access to the resource itself. Another design principle was that locally tailored rules define resource access and consumption. Right? There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to these. And again, we're using the example in Valencia, Spain, among these irrigation communities. There are several different canal districts, and each one has different rules about how farmers tell each other how they're going to get the water on a particular day. For example, here in this canal district, the Ras Caña Canal District, the farmer there, Ernesto, is standing by a little blackboard. And each morning when the farmer wants water, they go to this little blackboard, you write your name on it and the time, and you take the key, and then you can open up the gate that allows the water to come into your canal. And then if somebody else comes, they can see that Ernesto has the key and they can go find him. But in other canal districts, all the farmers meet together at sunrise and determine who's going to get the water and in what order. So there are different rules, different customs. You don't necessarily need a one-size-fits-all approach, right? The rules need to be tailored to the local conditions. The third design principle that Ostrom found was that individuals who are most affected by the rules can participate in decision-making. This is really critical and reflected Ostrom's dedication to self-governance. She found that when people have the agency to develop those rules themselves, they are more invested, they're going to enforce those rules, and those rules are going to be more fair, rather than having rules imposed upon them from the outside. The rules developed by the people themselves are going to have more legitimacy. Number 4 is that resource monitors are accountable to the resource users. In the case of Valencia, Spain, on the irrigation communities, the resources, the water, is monitored by a group of engineers called water guards. And that device there is called the gancho. And it's a pole with a sharp end on it, which historically was used to lift the canal gates or remove debris from the canal itself. Today, it's more of a ceremonial piece of equipment. But these water guards are there to make sure that the water is flowing appropriately, and they handle any technical concerns about water. The farmer can complain directly to them if they're not getting water on a particular day. But those water guards are accountable to the resource users. They are employed by the water court, the Tribunal de las Aguas, and that is organized by the farmers themselves. The 5th design principle is that there are graduated penalties that can be imposed on rule breakers, right? It's one thing to have rules that are developed by the community, but those rules need to be enforced. And you don't want to go and toss someone out and deny them access to irrigation water, which would destroy their livelihood for a first-time offense. There might be, a warning, for example, then a moderate penalty, and then this water court, they can decide to deny someone water for if they're a repeat offender. All right, so you want to have graduated penalties for rule breakers. Number 6 is that conflict management institutions are accessible. And this water court, the Tribunal de las Aguas in Valencia, is a great example of this. Like I said, these members of the water court here in the black robes, they are farmers themselves who their peers have elected them to the water court. And the water court meets every Thursday in front of the cathedral in Valencia. And they've done so every Thursday, more or less, for the last 1,000 years. The earliest documentation is from 960 AD. If there's a conflict, if one farmer left the gate open and flooded another farmer's field, ruining their crops, then they can bring a complaint to this water court. And that complaint is aired publicly. As a tourist or a community member, you can go and watch the proceedings in front of the cathedral at noon on Thursdays. And the members of the water court hear the dispute, and then they make a determination right there about who's been wronged and what the penalty might be. So this is a very accessible form of justice, specifically for disputes over water. There should be a right to self-organization. With the case of the water court in Valencia, the Spanish Constitution that was written in the 1970s specifically carves out the jurisdiction of the water court in matters of water disputes in Valencia. So the water court, has a history goes back 1,000 years. So there's a really strong tradition here, and the authorities recognize that they have this special jurisdiction as part of their culture. And finally, Ostrom found that complex systems should be organized into layers of nested governance, a thing that she called polycentricity, where there are many centers of governance and decision-making in a nested system. So in this case, you have the irrigation fields, then you have a canal district, and then those canal districts are organized within the whole water court, the Tribunal de las Aguas. Local disputes can be handled at the subcanal or canal district level, and then major disputes and big management decisions get handled at the highest levels, right? So not every problem rises up to the level of the whole water court. So those are the 8 design principles, and she developed these by looking at local commons, fisheries, forests, irrigation communities, and things like that. And Ostrom started wondering if these principles for local commons could be applied to global commons, like the climate system. She was looking at this as far back as 1992 with her colleague Michael McGinnis, also at Indiana University. But then she really got involved with climate change around 2008, 2009, 2010, around the time she was awarded the Nobel Prize. She noted that many analysts have presumed that an enforceable global agreement is the only way to address the threat of climate change, right? She notes that many analysts think that way, but as I mentioned before, she also said, if we just wait for the big guys to come up with a decision, well, then we're all in deep trouble. Climate change requires a unified response. Everybody needs to be working together, but it does not require a uniform response. We don't all have to do the same thing. We should all be working together to achieve the same goal, but we don't have to do it in exactly the same ways. So Ostrom, thought, well, can a collaborative approach work? If a top-down approach hasn't been working and we're still waiting for these big guys to make a decision, maybe a more collaborative approach could work. One that's based on rules, like the rules developed in the Tribunal de las Aguas. Rules that can be enforced, and there should be systems, institutions that can hold people accountable. And for a global commons, polycentricity is going to be critical, right? It's unlikely that we're going to get a one-size-fits-all top-down policy. It's much more manageable if we have multiple units of decision-making. We have a global challenge, but we have nations, We have subnational units like states and provinces. Then we have cities. Everybody can be doing a little bit, and all of that work can add up to a global response. So she really believed, and based on evidence, that a polycentric approach may be the best way to address the climate crisis. And this is a long passage, but I think it's important, so I'd just like to read it to you. Ostrom said, "Given the severity of the threat, simply waiting for the resolution of these issues at the global level without trying out policies at multiple scales because they lack a global scale is not a reasonable stance. The advantage of a polycentric approach is that it encourages experimentation by multiple actors, as well as the development of methods for assessing the benefits and costs of particular strategies adopted in one setting and comparing these results obtained in other settings." Right, so polycentric approach can enable, we can get started now. We don't have to wait for the big guys to make a decision, and we can experiment. Michigan can do something, New York can do something, Spain can do something. We can all learn from one another at different scales and adopt what works and discard what doesn't. So that brings us to 2015 and the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, the structure of it, largely follows Ostrom's design principles for governing the climate commons. The Paris Agreement was passed in 2015, several years after Ostrom died in 2012. So she never directly participated in this. And it's not clear that the architects of the Paris Agreement were directly using Ostrom's ideas, but it's clear that there may have been some influence, but they may have just converged because this system seems to work well. The Paris Agreement is not a legally binding treaty. It doesn't have a one-size-fits-all approach for the whole globe. Instead, it's based on a pledge and review approach. And it's polycentric, meaning there's room for experimentation and accountability at different scales. All of the countries of the world through the Paris Agreement have adopted this goal of limiting additional warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the goal, right? We're all working together to achieve that goal, but we don't all have to do it the same way. Through this pledge and review approach, each country comes forward with an emissions reduction pledge called a nationally determined contribution. And then countries compare their pledges to peer countries. So the United States comes forward with a pledge. Our pledge now is 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. That pledge gets compared to other peer countries like Canada, the UK, Australia, Japan, members of the European Union. And the leaders look, are the pledges ambitious enough? Can one country do a little bit more? How do we raise the ambition together? And then, of course, pledges are just words. Like Greta Thunberg said, blah, 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 words, words, words. We need action. These plans have to be implemented. So you need to implement the policies at the national level and subnational levels. These can be things like a carbon tax, cap and trade, technical regulations, vehicle efficiency standards, right? There are lots of different ways to achieve this goal. Some are going to be more appropriate than others for a particular country or a particular subnational unit, a state, a province. We all, like I said, climate change requires a unified response, but not a uniform one. And that's really where this polycentric architecture of the Paris Agreement can possibly work. The challenge is that so far, the pledges have not been sufficient to reach that 1 degree C of additional warming goal. Enforcement is likely to be the biggest challenge. The fifth design principle was that graduated penalties can be imposed on rule breakers. And if this is not a legally binding treaty, how do we enforce the rules around climate change and the Paris Agreement? Well, there are various different ways. One could be appeals to reputation, what's sometimes called a name and shame approach. When the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement under the President Trump's administration, the world reacted. And I attended the 2019 Conference of Parties, the big climate summit that's happening now in Glasgow. In 2019, it was in Madrid. And I got to go there for research on this book. And there was a big climate march. And there were lots of signs like this one saying world shame and danger, Trump. Right? People were very upset at the United States. And that was really clear, not only among the people marching in this parade, but also among the diplomats meeting at the climate summit. So there's definitely peer pressure and appeals to reputation. The United States sees itself as a world leader. It needs to step up and demonstrate that leadership when it comes to climate change. But sometimes that's not enough. Just appeals to reputation may not be enough. So a typical way we deal with that is through trade sanctions. If a country decides not to impose, not to follow through on its pledge, they might get, an advantage in manufacturing, for example, against a country that has an ambitious pledge and is really working hard to reduce its emissions. Manufacturing may be a little bit more costly in that country. Well, through trade sanctions and what's called a border carbon adjustment, the country that's following through on its pledge can put a carbon-based tariff on imports from the non-participating country, the free-riding country. So trade sanctions can be a tool that's being actively talked about now. And finally, possibly, I've heard people talk about criteria for membership in certain groups being linked to aggressive climate action. One person I spoke with mentioned NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance or organization. NATO recognizes that climate change is a threat to its military, to security among the different countries and worldwide. And if this is a major threat to security, then perhaps the member countries of NATO should be doing something about it. I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but we have lots of different organizations, and perhaps membership in these organizations could be contingent on, aggressive climate action. So these principles are being tested as leaders gather for the COP26 Global Climate Summit in Scotland right now. Ostrom emphasized that we are not limited to the market or the state, that we, the people, have solutions that are created by and for local communities. We don't have to wait for the big guys to act. We can be doing things now and scaling up those solutions for a global response. As the meeting goes forward, the the national leaders at this COP26 climate summit will be trying to raise ambition together. Like I said, these pledges are not sufficient to achieve that 1.5 degrees C target. They're going to be leaning on each other to ramp up their emissions pledges and also have policies that follow through on the implementation. Ostrom often used the phrase, nobody wants to be a sucker. Nobody wants to be the first country to take on all the costs of reducing greenhouse gases if nobody else is going to do that, right? And this young woman was somebody I met at that climate march in Madrid, and she had a sign that said, "Don't be a sucker." So I thought that was really appropriate and a good image that illustrates one of Ostrom's principles. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this presentation. And one more thing. Ostrom said that a core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions that bring out the best in humans. She really believed in democracy and self-governance. So I think that is a positive message as we go forward. If you'd like to learn more about the work of Elinor Ostrom, I wrote a book that came out this summer. It's called The Uncommon Knowledge of Elinor Ostrom, Essential Lessons for Collective Action, and it's available through Island Press. If you go to their website, islandpress.org, you can find it. Use the code UNCOMMON for a 20% discount. And also there, you'll see a little tab for educator resources. I've put together some free course materials. You don't even have to buy the book. You can just grab those free course materials. It has a sample syllabus, lecture slides, and a list of additional readings if you're interested. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share my work.